Hi there and welcome. My name is Derek Feldman. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to spend the next hour talking about this recent release of our Phase 2 research from the Millennial Impact Project and this year's report, The Power of Voice. We're excited that you're with us. My name is Derek Feldman, as I mentioned. I'm the founder of Achieve as well as the founder of the Millennial Impact Project. I'll be joined by my colleague, the Director of Research at Achieve here and also part of the project, Dr. Amy Thayer. Over the course of the next hour, we're going to spend time talking about what we've learned since kind of to date and where we've been over the last several years with the project, give you some context as to how we did the research methodology this year, which is quite different than last year. And then from there, we'll talk about some of the key findings that we have and sort of the key takeaways. If you had a chance to download the report so far, I suspect that you've noticed it's a fairly large report with a lot of data in it. It's not possible to cover every single data point, as you can imagine, in our discussion. And so please, obviously, if you have questions, put those into the GoToWebinar panel that's on your screen, or feel free to email us, and we'll get back to you on certain data points that you might have for you or your colleagues that want to have or record or play this session later on. We'll make sure and make it available to you. The presentation that we're offering here today, too, as well, will be available, including anything else that we'll talk about. If you need any additional resources that are mentioned during the call, our team will make sure that those are available as well. Again, we're excited that we'll be with you for about 45 minutes. We're getting through the information, and then the last 15 minutes, we're going to open it up to some questions. To ensure that we get through as much as we can, we're not going to necessarily address the questions in the first 45 minutes, but we will do that in the last 15 minutes. So feel free to put those in, and we'll work our way through as many as possible. We'll review the questions, too, after this webinar session, and we'll try to answer as many as possible to the larger group that had attended. Again, thanks for joining us over the course of this next hour. It's important that we begin in thanking our supporter in all of this, really almost close to the last 10 years. The Case Foundation has been instrumental in trying to understand how and why millennials get involved with causes and civic issues as well, civic engagement. They have been the underwriting supporter of this initiative since 2009, as well as an MCON, and we couldn't do it without their ongoing support and dedication to understanding this and helping organizations as well as the population get involved. And so thank you to the Case Foundation, and please also share that thanks online if you can. In addition, I want to give you a little bit of context as we get to today. Every year we produce a Millennial Impact Report, several different reports or briefings based upon different phases overall. And as we look at those phases and we look at how those different trends and changes, we're consistently looking at behavioral as well as attitudinal, and some of our research will obviously extend year to year. I think what's important to start is looking at 2 years ago and where we were and kind of where we are today. In 2015, we started to share a finding and some things that we were starting to notice, that we were moving more towards a actionable environment. Activism was getting stronger, and interest in sort of reflecting that maturation that we've been talking about of this generation. Moving beyond just simple things like donations or volunteering, but also participating and raising their voice in some way, shape, or form. We noticed that in 2015, but didn't necessarily talk too much about it. We just said this is something that we are going to monitor as we go forward. Now in 2016, we did a fairly extensive series of reports because we were looking at the election year overall. We looked and started in the spring when there were 6 candidates on the Republican side and 3 on the Democratic side, and we wanted to see how does cause behavior change over the course of an election year, especially as we see certain topics, maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's economics or employment or education, started to get into the national discourse. And what was interesting about that is we started to look through things. We noticed one thing. One is that we were starting to see more passive forms of involvement, civic and cause engagement. And we noted it. We said that it's been a little bit down with the panels and individuals that were a part of our study. We also looked at and noticed that of our panels and the individuals that were part of the study over the course of the year, that we actually had more millennials being reported voting than most everybody kind of believed in a way. And we didn't necessarily know if all of the individuals that were part of our panels were just in the minority in this large situation or not. But we did start to see that overall. And as a result, it was important to not necessarily say that was 2016, because as we know, there's been some interesting things that have occurred since November that has either sparked or what we might think would spark cause engagement. So we couldn't necessarily look at 2016 on its own, as its own silo. We had to connect it to where do we go now? Because as I mentioned, 2015 we started to see this rise. 2016 we start to see something very different, although muted. And then we started to see civic participation as well, just in traditional forms like voting. So that left us to where are we now post-election, and especially post-new administration too. And we had three major questions overall. What are the characteristics of the social issues? And you can see these on your screen right now. And they tend to see higher millennial participation rates. People were coming back to us and saying, what are you seeing from that perspective? What are millennials' levels of engagement in these social issues, and how are those levels selected, and how do they evolve, of course? And then lastly, we were looking at what are the characteristics of millennials who participate at each level of these engagements, right? We wanted to figure out, as of today, post-election, post-new and into 2017, what's happening, what are they directing those actions towards, and the why behind it too as well. So we entered into several different phases of the research this year. The first phase, as you're going to see here, is that we were trying to understand whether or not in 2016, is that just passive, or are we going to get more active as we were going forward? And has it increased, and did it increase substantially? And so in our methodology overall, we organized the research into three major phases. As you'll see on your screen, the first phase was to do a small qualitative piece. We want to go out into the field, hear directly from millennials across the country as to what things that they were noticing, what issues that they were partaking with. We didn't want to go to the field first with a quantitative measure. We wanted to go out and hear directly from those millennials that were a part of our studies and so forth. We did that up until June. We, at MCon, released the event that we host with the Case Foundation, had launched that piece and element in June and said, this is what we're hearing. We had let everybody in at that moment and said, we don't know necessarily if this will hold true or not, because even in June, even those sort of January to June time frame had a lot going on, and then even June to now as well. But we did say at MCon, these are the things that we're noticing, but things that we need to pay attention to. So in phase two, we did a quantitative method study, obviously, and this is the release of those data points. And we actually are going to go even step further and do some ethnographic inquiry in the last phase. We're going to make sure that what we're hearing in this survey data here is also validated further in ethnographic measures, of course, and we'll cover that towards the end. So this year's research, three phases, started with a qualitative, countrywide sort of focus group qualitative interviews. Second phase, which is what I'm reporting today, is that qualitative survey data. And the third piece is that ethnographic inquiry, which will happen now till the end of the year. In January, we'll report back the full year 2017 activism activity and so forth, and the key things that we've learned, which will tee us up for next year's 2018 study. If you want to look at our panel, the 3,000 individuals that were a part of this phase, you can see some of those demographics. And I'm not going to go into big detail here, which you can look at those in the report. But there is a couple of things that you should notice. All of this is a representative sample based upon our census data as well. We wanted to make sure that we had not only urban, but also suburban areas too as well, and also rural areas. We also looked at, if you think about the employment age and gender, all of those things were representative of our typical millennial population as we see it today based upon those projections from the census. Again, you can go further into some of this as you read the report. When we were thinking about the topics, we wanted to ensure that we were also diving deep into why, how, and at what level were they engaged in those causes or social issues. We didn't necessarily want them to tell us, I like this, but I'm doing this for this issue as well, or for a population of people that I'm trying to help. And did those actions, from their perspective, actually achieve something in general? So if they felt like they voted, or if they posted something on social media, did it achieve the outcome that they desired, in essence? So was the action worthy of what they were wanting to make happen? And of course the last one, which is around what are their attitudes and behaviors, and did they remain or change since that time that we were out there in 2016 and really over the course of the last 12 months? So all of the design of the methodology and the questioning protocol that we were going through kept these three major influences and pieces in mind. Now, I think it's incredibly important that you understand when we went out into the field to get the survey mechanism completed. We held the survey, and it was in the field from July the 19th through August the 8th. There were several things that were actually happening during that time that potentially could influence some of the cause issues that you'll see up there. And we historically have not talked about when we're in the field doing survey collection. But we felt, given everything going on, it is important that we let you know exactly what was happening in the national discussions as well as in the country during that time frame. Wildfires were occurring on July the 19th. On the 26th of July, President Trump had tweeted about banning transgender people from the military. The 28th of July, the Republican bill to repeal Obamacare had failed. August 2nd, the Justice Department looked to reevaluate affirmative action. And August 2nd, the same day, the President and 2 senators unveiled a RAISE Act, which would reduce legal immigration to the U.S. by half annually. These events and activities over the course ensures that we're very clear with you and transparent about when we were in the field collecting some of the attitudinal pieces that you'll see and hear in here. And it also may be something that we're going to further deepen as we go into the qualitative ethnographic research further, which is, are these issues still some of the top issues that millennials care about? This is where they are now, but will those change based upon additional discussions, additional potential social policy change, as well as any events that will occur in the country between now and then? So here is our major findings. The first section, I'm going to turn over to our Director of Research here, Dr. Amy Thayer, to talk about how they voted and where the country is. And then I'll come back in a little bit. Dr. Thayer?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So their voting was an important aspect of this report in this investigation for a few reasons. One, as Derek said, our 2016 report wrapped up just immediately post-election 2016. And so as he said, we really wanted to understand how many people actually did vote, for whom did they vote, and what did those ramifications of that voting mechanism sort of garner. And so when we asked how they voted, nearly 2/3, and that would be 65% of our millennials within our study, said that they had voted in the 2016 election. And as you break it down by gender, you can see nearly 3/4 of male millennials voted, whereas just over half of female millennials reported that they voted in the 2016 election. Likewise, similar breakdown for both older and younger millennials, with older millennials reporting a higher rate of voting than the younger millennials. Now, when we break it up across educational attainment, I think the key point to see in this chart is really to understand that while folks with some college reported more voting, when you actually hit the group of folks who have completed some kind of college degree, all the way from an associate's degree all the way up to a doctorate degree of some form or fashion, those are when the very solid yes, I did vote really seemed to shine through. So in thinking about how they voted, that was something our 2016 report was somewhat, it was an interesting finding for us. Early on in the 2016 report, we had somewhere in the 20 percentage points indicating that they would vote for Donald Trump. Post-election, we found out that 40%, in the 40 percentage points, indicated that they did in fact vote for Donald Trump. As you look across race and ethnicity, as you can see, 51% of our aggregate respondents reported voting for Hillary Clinton, whereas 35% voted for Donald Trump. And when you split that up by race and ethnicity categories, you see that higher percentages of white Caucasian millennial respondents voted for Donald Trump or reported voting for Donald Trump, with just 41%, a close percentage behind that voting for Hillary Clinton. Now, when you look at minority racial groups, you can see that by and large the highest percentage of those folks voted for Hillary Clinton, and by a much higher percentage point than those who voted for any other candidate. Trying to understand why participants did not vote. So among the 35% of our respondents who indicated that they did not vote in the 2016 election, what you can see is, like I think the general public reported, 31% of them, almost a third of them, just said they didn't like either candidate. And so we found that to be true in the 2016 report as well. And then looking on through the line, the percentages drop off from there. And so another important point that we focused on within this survey instrument was to really look at how millennials saw the state of the country post-election. And as you can see, 39% said the country was taking the wrong or the absolutely wrong direction. Another almost third indicated that they were unsure, it was too soon to tell. They wanted to see how things sort of unfolded before they could answer that question. And then finally, 21% said that the country is headed in the right direction, with another 8% agreeing that absolutely the current direction was the right direction. So as you see, by and large, the majority of our millennial respondents were not happy with the direction the country was taking at this point. And so as we break that down into subsegments of our millennial respondents, you see that more female millennials, more younger millennials, and those millennials with a lower educational attainment. So those folks with high school diploma, some high school, some college, thought that the country was actually moving in the wrong direction much more than the other segments of millennials in our study. And so one question that we absolutely had to ask was, what is their satisfaction with the current president? Knowing that most of our sample voted for Hillary Clinton, we wanted to understand, were folks satisfied, unsatisfied with Donald Trump? And what we found was nearly half of our respondents were unsatisfied or extremely unsatisfied with President Trump at this point in time. A little more than a quarter were satisfied or extremely satisfied, and then just under a quarter indicated that they were neutral. They were, again, probably those folks who were waiting to see how things unfolded before they could report. As we look at the different subsegments, again, looking at satisfaction with President Trump, we see that far more female millennials were less satisfied with President Trump compared to male millennials. Younger millennials, more than half, were less satisfied than the older millennials that we surveyed. And then far more minority millennials, particularly Black and African American millennials, as you see, 69% were less satisfied than the white Caucasian respondents, which makes sense, seemingly, because more white Caucasian respondents did in fact vote for Donald Trump. So really, just to wrap up this section before Derek goes into our first major finding, is that nearly 2/3 of the millennials of our sample reported that they voted in the 2016 presidential election. Now, within the report, we talk a bit about that in comparison to other reports on how the millennial generation voted. Of the folks that voted, you can see about 75% of male respondents did in fact vote. Half the respondents who were a part of our survey cast a vote for for Hillary Clinton, and then more minorities also voted for Clinton, whereas whites and Caucasians tended to vote for Donald Trump. So of the respondents who did not vote, again, the largest percentage said that they just didn't like any of the candidates available. And then of our sample, less than a third thought the country was going in what they determined the quote-unquote right direction. And this was during the time in which they took the survey. And then finally, nearly half of our sample reported that they were unsatisfied or extremely unsatisfied with the president at the time that they took the survey. And so all of these key points are sort of things for you to keep in mind as we further unveil the findings from our research.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. So I'm going to move into now what we are calling the doing good section of the report. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into some of the data that was presented there. First, we wanted to understand what causes and social issues they were most interested in, and then what did they do with those issues at all? Remember, we wanted to see, had those changed, obviously from last year's 2016, and at the same time, what was the level of activation, activism, philanthropic behavior that would have been seen from that? And when we were going into the field, obviously we were capturing some qualitative components here, which are sprinkled throughout the report that you can read as well. If you look at the top 3 causes and social issues of most interest, civil rights and racial discrimination was 29%. And the second one is around employment and job creation. Lastly, looking at healthcare. Again, it's important to keep in context what was happening during that week too as well, and when the individuals could have taken the survey instrument, and as we mentioned, what social policies were up for vote during that congressional time period. If you look at some of the other issues that have come up as well, you can see those on your screen now. As you'll see in the sort of top list on your left-hand side, issues around climate change, wages and employment, environment, and education are in there, where we have seen them before. But I would say that in looking at this year's, the civil rights piece had come to the top in that one. We have had social justice issues in the past too. If you look at that as a breakdown by race and ethnicity, whether or not there was some influence to their interest levels, the white Caucasian component was healthcare reform, employment, and civil rights. Spanish and Hispanic was immigration, civil rights, and racial discrimination. The Black African American respondents, civil rights, racial discrimination, and employment. And Asian participants, climate change, employment, civil rights, racial discrimination, and healthcare reform. So all of these are in the report that you can look at based upon subgroups that were a part of the study, the representative sample. If you look at it from residential location, remember earlier I had mentioned that we wanted to ensure, based upon some of the context that was happening out of the 2016 research, that we had both rural, urban, suburban environments throughout the country. And so if you splice the data by those that reside in urban environments, civil rights, employment, and healthcare were the top 3 there in that order. The suburban element was healthcare, civil rights, and employment. Small town, employment, healthcare, civil rights. And the rural environment, healthcare, employment, and civil rights. We have all these definitions, of course, in the report that you can take a look at. Again, this is looking at the data for those millennials who are in various aspects of the country, as well as various aspects in residential environments. Then we wanted to look at the top actions taken for those social issues and causes. It was interesting to note that of the 3,000 that were part of the study, they all performed in the last year more than 13,000 actions. So it's a fairly active group. When we look at those actions over the course of the last 12 months, this is what we find. The vast majority of them are the top one, and the top action, sorry, is the voted for political representatives are done then by signing petitions online in particular. The third one is then posting and sharing of social media. Now, it's important to note where that sits. Obviously, the voting component, this was an election year, so it is noted that we have that as one of the top actions. The number 4 one is very key for the corporate community. They actually changed their service or product purchasing environments because of certain policies or anything else. The 4th one was around contacting contacting and expressing opinions to political representatives, marches and rally participation, donation, and then even protests in the end. I think there's a couple things as we have looked at the study and have been doing this for many years, is looking at these traditional forms are mixed in with non-traditional forms of civic engagement that we may say they're non-traditional now, but they're newer to opportunities and offerings. Online petition signing as a newer offering than our traditional petition signing in the past. But what's also interesting, and we make note of this in the report, that millennials are doing traditional and non-traditional forms. So to say that you as a cause and organization should only focus on newer digital technologies versus, say, other forms of civic engagement would be incorrect based upon what we've seen. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, with 2015 and the rise of activism, that participation in traditional forms of activism has risen since that time. And so looking at things like marches and rallies and as well as different types of elements of protest or contacting representatives, what we see in this is definitely a rise in activism. And for organizations who don't have an activism or advocacy arm to them, how will you use millennials? Because as we see here, donation or volunteerism wasn't necessarily in that top categories as we saw with the other elements. So this is a key important piece for causes to sit down and think through how they're aligning staff resources to effectively engage millennials using their voice appropriately. If you look at the top 3, as I mentioned here, they were obviously, as I said, the political representatives signing petitions and sharing of social media. Now there is something else that's kind of interesting to note too. The technical top third was taking no action at all. If you looked at the actions they took, we reported it correctly. Those were the top 3 actions. But if you look at whether they took action at all, it actually was the 3rd one. And so the top 3 things overall was voting, petition signing, and taking no action. And so as we look at it, we still have a long way to move, obviously, from interest to action, with that being in the top 3 category on some of the social issues. And of course, sharing of social media is there, but it technically was the number 4 after doing nothing. When we look at educational attainment as an influence as it comes to social issues, we noticed a trend, of course. So did the number 1 action become voting for political representatives with similar views. And so there was a correlation to educational attainment that we noted. There is another influence around race and ethnicity that we noticed, and also mentioned this in the report, that the took no action responses reported by Asian millennials in particular ranked higher than any of the other ethnicities ranking of the same. And that's, of course, you can see in the report in the section on doing good. If you want to look at the overall actions by certain issues, so this chart is really important if you represent a cause or you are working with people that represent causes, and you can see the top issues here on your left-hand side and the top actions performed for those issues. This is something that you would want to sit down as an organization and say, for what we see here, are we aligning and asking millennials to participate in these activities, knowing that these are the top actions they're actually doing? So this is a very key one as you sit down internally to understand millennial activation and what are we asking millennials to do. I suspect this is a good conversation to have around fundraising volunteerism, as we see some of the other activism components were much higher in a lot of these key issue areas. So again, a key piece that we'll talk about in our takeaways. And you can even see here on some additional components on the most performed actions. Again, this is all in the research in the research report that you can have, or that you do have right now. If we look at the typical actions taken, we wanted to understand from their perspective whether or not they actually felt those actions made a difference. It's one thing to post something, but do you believe that post in social media will create change? So we had to understand not just what happened, but their belief in that action and whether or not it will equate in something from their perspective, not necessarily the institutional perspective. By the way, that's what the Millennial Impact Project has been built on, which is understanding millennials from their viewpoint, not necessarily the outside viewpoint of institutions or anywhere else. What's interesting is we see in the top categories, top 4 categories, signing petitions they felt is one of the things that can cause change in their actions and what they did. Attending protests and rallies, 16% and 10%, and contacting and voting, or voting for their representatives. I think it's important to note, this is very key in the digital space, because there's an assumption that obviously in posting of social media or using the social environment to help us create change, social media with our individuals was number 4 in total, looking at whether or not those actions done in social media will actually create change. Other traditional forms actually outweighed that. And so it's important here, again, to talk through how you allocate resources accordingly when it comes to activating the audience in general. We're not saying not to, to stop social media. It's a very important component. And it really is an and piece, not an or. But it is important to understand what the individual believes change will happen. And so asking millennials to participate in those elements that they believe is possible to social change is very, very key. So do you match that together with what you're trying to ask them to do? When we look at an influence and doing good around the relationship to a group, we wanted to look further deep into whether or not they're participating because they're personally affected by an issue, or if there is somebody else too as well. And when we look at it, 44% of respondents took a cause or social issue related action because they were part of a group that they felt was being treated unfairly. A third were prompted to take action on behalf of the group which they were not a part of. So in essence, you have a population of people doing stuff for others who they felt was treated unfairly. And if you look at that, actually it was 10% more for males in that category than in females. And only 16% said the negative impact they believe the election had on a cause moved them to action, regardless of standing with the groups affected. So what we see here is that opportunity and action for others, the beneficiary, the helping, the individual that may not be representative of themselves. So true philanthropic behavior as well, and also looking at how sort of the social rights or human rights aspect of this definitely comes out. We wanted to know, is it a local versus national environment on some of these issues? And how do they support? And in general, what we noticed is most of them do support local. A group of them support local and national. This is key. We are in a hyper-local environment, and we notice now that millennials obviously are looking for local change to happen in and around them. And if you want to break that down by gender, you can see that there. It's most notably here that females support more local causes in our study that was reported than males. And as you can see here in the male environment, 38% and 42%. In voting behaviors in general around doing good, 71% of respondents identified voting as a form of activism in some way, shape, or form, just not as a part of it, just in addition to potentially the part of civic duty. The higher the education attainment of the respondent, the more likely they are to believe voting will lead to change. Again, we're looking at how the actions that they believe in their perspective will create change. And when you look at it and you break it down by education attainment, as I mentioned, you can kind of see here where the numbers lay out. Obviously, they get more educated, it does decrease or increase in the yes category. So here are some key points in the doing good. If we had to sum it all together for you, the top 3 important issues right now, as we've seen, when we've been in the field: civil rights, racial discrimination, employment, which is essentially they were looking at job creation, and healthcare reform. The largest portion of respondents participate in local causes, and then obviously local and national together. When it comes to the top action taken by respondents, voting is the top issue, and within each demographic subsegment, voting is also seen as a vital form of activism, which I think some of us may have been a little afraid of if it wasn't. And then in general, the most active millennials were college-educated and males who supported groups of which they actually were not a part of. And when we get into the naming good, which I'm going to ask Dr. Thayer to do here in a second, we got to understand, how do they believe in themselves when they are participating in these actions? Because all of these key points will dovetail with how they label themselves, if at all. So Dr. Thayer, you're up.
Yeah, so this was a really important question for us to understand. How do they label themselves? Because coming out of our 2016 study, we recognized that millennials were sort of shying away from, and that might be putting it mildly, they really were not labeling themselves as activists, although they were participating, even as Derek said, 13,000 actions that they took in the past year, so they are active on behalf of causes they're interested in. So we wanted to ask them, how do you label yourself? Is it an activist, is it an ally, is it an advocate, or a supporter? And so we asked them actually how they label themselves on behalf of the actions that they took for a particular cause. And then later we asked them, okay, so if you label yourself as an activist, what do you think is that definition for that term? And so you can see here across all 4 labels, we listed the highest percentages of the definition they chose to define. For instance, an activist, 27% said that an activist was one who actively campaigns to bring about political and social change. And that actually was the dictionary definition, if you will. And so I think it's important to also note here that we took definitions that we received from participants in phase 1, offered those up as response options, in addition to the traditional or dictionary definition of each one of these labels. And so as you can see, as it goes down, for ally, advocate, and supporter, you can see that nearly a quarter of folks picked one distinct definition over the other. And then in the report, you can really compare who decided to call themselves what and how that matched up with the actual definition. And so when we look at it by gender, overall, most of our respondents indicated that they were supporters. But further, when you break it down between male and female millennials, you can see that many more female millennials labeled themselves as supporters. And so when we looked at distinctive labels and looked at how they describe them, supporters on the issues of early education, post-secondary education, criminal justice, sexual orientation, and women's rights. And then when we looked at what supporters found the issues of most interest, we can see that they chose employment, poverty, and wages as the issues that were the most important to them. And so when we look at how the actions that they took on behalf of these distinctive issues, you can see divided by categories, irrespective of how they labeled themselves, voting was the #1 action that they took. And then signing petitions are the same across all 4 categories. Then it changes when you get down into the 3rd. And you can see there where activists really sets itself apart or distinguishes itself by contacting representatives, where the other 3 groups sort of took a bit more passive role in posting on social media. And so there's more description, as Derek said in the report, on this particular piece as well. And so in summarizing sort of the naming good piece, the labels that they selected really seem to transcend, if you will, demographic groups. They, by and large, thought of themselves as supporters. Supporters are the group that seemed to be the most unhappy with the direction that the country was taking. And it's important to point out that they weren't really apathetic. They just were still sort of unsure of what was going to happen. So they wanted to see what unfolded before they acted. And then the majority of millennials still really don't see themselves as activists, although the way that they participate are the ways that most traditional definitions of activists would really support. And so now I'll turn it back over to Derek to talk about increasing good.
Great, thanks Amy, I appreciate that. So in the increasing good section, we wanted to understand how they would increase, how are millennials acting to increase their support of social causes, and really why is that happening in general. The intensity and level of commitment and where they've been since the time that, over the last 12 months or so, we wanted to see, has it increased? Is the election also a part of that too as well? Individually achieving change, 53% believe their actions would lead to some sort of improvement that they had seen. So of those actions, those that we reported of the panel, the 3,000, 53% had believed that there would be some sort of improvement. 14% did not believe the actions they were performing would lead to improved conditions at all. So this is that sense of, will it really actually change? And then a full third were kind of unsure. If you look at that via education attainment, where are you, yes, no, or unsure, you can see it by, of course, education. More education, we saw the more yes category, and then the less overall. In the no category, obviously, it would be there too. The top answer, 49% or higher of every action, was that millennials had not changed the frequency of such actions since the election. But at the same time, respondents who said their actions had increased far outnumber those whose actions had actually decreased since the election. So those that were taking these actions increased substantially since that election and sort of decreased in that environment. And when we look at it, sort of, we try to want to understand change via institutions. We hear a lot around, well, are millennials working in and around institutions? Are they deciding to work with traditional organizations, the government, and so forth? We set out this year to answer that, especially now, where some of our traditional institutions might be going away, or newer ones are coming in, or are they coming back to some of the traditional institutions as well? So via change, these institutions, they have felt their family and friends, and you can kind of see where they see they're increasing good at, or they're about as active, kind of like whether or not these entities in and around them were utilizing some of these institutions too, and then less active, of course, as you can see here. I think the key thing is looking at how that individual and its peer, its circle around them, how are they acting as well through change, and what that means. Are they being as active as they are from their perspective or not? Though respondents indicated they believed in and were trying to inspire change through these actions, they did not abandon their trust. So this is a key piece around institutions. Although the direction that we have was sort of, they didn't believe it was great and unsure, right, if you combine those two, as well as dissatisfaction with administration, they were still working through institutions. So institutions do play an important part around, in addition to individual change, of course. And so they had not abandoned, especially even the government, as an opportunity for change. And we think that's an important finding as we look now, as so many organizations are wondering whether or not they maintain relevance, and can they, or are they working outside of these organizations? And the answer is both, but they do see these institutions as change makers in that perspective. 57% remain confident, or really very confident, in the ability of the organizations they support to solve the issues they care about. This is a key factor. This means gets affinity and loyalty towards the issue and your organization, potentially involving them further. And if you look at how confident they are by males or females, you can kind of see where they are, the differences between the two. Nothing completely substantial to note here, although the somewhat confident and is a little bit higher on the female side than others. But overall, we wanted to share that, and this is detailed in the report too as well. And if you look at a closer look at how the actions differed by labels, because we were curious that way, as you can kind of see here how that played out versus the activist, advocate, ally, and supporter. Again, this whole graph is in the report. I just want to call out a few key things that you'll notice here. And when they look at how they label themselves, and then the second row, were they confident in the actions of the organizations? The activists kind of see there was at 39%. They were very confident and confident that from an activist perspective, if they labeled themselves that way, that the organizations were going to go out there and do something incredibly positive and make change happen. So when you look at this chart, that belief in affinity and loyalty towards institutions, and that belief that they can actually make change, this is an important key piece if they view themselves as an activist or even a supporter. So here's some key points to kind of summarize this piece now, which is, of our respondents, or 3,000, 53%, they feel equally comfortable, and as well as organizations, 57% ability to create change in support of the causes that they're actually working with, which is a good sign, as we see here, especially as we go into looking at how the government could address as well. At the time, they were not satisfied with the way the president was addressing the causes important to them, as we mentioned earlier. And the respondents may believe that individual organizations need to work in tandem, something that we're going to further explore together. We need to dive deeper down into the institutional change piece. Obviously, as social change needs to happen and movements are created, it requires a mass body working with several different organizations and others to create that social change, both on the ground locally and federally and nationally. And so what we need to look at is how strong is that tie, and we'll further go into that in the ethnographic and as well as qualitative. And millennial respondents also appear to initiate action via the institution of government. Look at the actions of voting, contacting political representatives, not abandoning those, but actually participating in those. If you go back to the other section when we talked about those actions that they were doing, those are participation in the civic process. And so that's a good sign, obviously, if you're a proponent of good civic engagement with this generation. And it's equally as more traditional ways, such as volunteering to support causes. So I think this tells us at this point that we've got a couple key things of where we are, in essence. The first one is that the key takeaway for us, millennials believe the U.S. is moving in their own direction. However, they still engage with institutions, including the government. This is a key piece, and this is the value of institutions as we see, and as a way of creating positive change for causes, rather than just going about it alone or just self-organizing around an issue without an institution. So that's a very key piece. Now the question is whether or not your institution can capture that interest and move it to deeper action, vocal action first potentially, and then deeper donation and volunteerism support as they go forward. Couple things that we would recommend. First and foremost is that we need to think about millennials holistically, comprehensively, as assets overall, and not as every individual is for our social issues and causes. We're not donors, we're not volunteers, we're individuals necessarily supporting causes. Supporting those causes through multifaceted actions. Those actions can be things like attending protests and signing petitions and giving $10 and volunteering. You see from this year's report what those key actions are at the beginning. Are you, as an organization, asking for those? Have you organized your staff around that as well? I think, and as we mentioned in the report, I think every cause needs its own army of people around them that support the issue they address. The second one, we need to investigate the social policies at the state, obviously, and federal levels that impact your issue. Then address and utilize millennials to help address that as well. As we mentioned, localization of some of this stuff is very key to them. In addition to that national level, you do have a role to play at the local level, and helping them be active in that is important. And utilize millennials to engage other millennials. As we see a lot of this peer influence of family and friends around them, they are getting involved, but you need the activism environment, you need the advocacy, the speaking voice piece that goes beyond just peer fundraising or peer volunteerism. Where's the peer advocacy that you're also asking for, and peer activism in general? Key takeaway 2. The number one cause today, and this is always a fluctuation at times, is within this 6 months, is really civil rights, racial discrimination, job creation, employment, and then healthcare. We're going to continue to study this as we go through the rest of the year. And of course, in January, we'll come back to you with this is what we know. National discussions will move this. Of course, we know that. Social policy change, as millennials see themselves active in those, will also move this too. Couple of recommendations. We need to look at the issues and how they affect you, social policy. We would recommend that organizations become active in the educating process of their constituents around the social issues that are affecting them. And secondly, is accentuate the humanity associated with their cause through stories, social media, and more. Who is this person that they're trying to help and address through social policy? That is a key piece that may not have been there in the past. And then knowing your millennial supporters' interests and personal characteristics. There is, we have been studying this substantially. More than 115,000 people have been a part of our studies, and we still, every year, have to go out and discover the characteristics of this generation. And we're not necessarily saying that we're the experts in it, but what we do have is a lot of data to surround ourselves to understand the typical profile. Those profiles change. Those profiles change by issues, they change by actions. Ensure that you're spending the time to understand all of your constituents, not just millennials. But if you want to look at the millennial generation, then understand how those individuals might react to your issue, which would be different. The third one, most millennials don't self-identify as activists, even though they're participating in activism-style environments, right? So protest rallies, the typical definitions that we've been used to. And they're performing actions on behalf of social issues and causes with confidence and deliberateness. I mean, it's always an interesting discussion when we talk about, in some of our research, the thoughtlessness and thoughtfulness. That at times we do things impulsively, absolutely. We had found in this deliberate state is that a lot of them were taking deliberate action, and that action was in person and online, both. And also this population looking at which things could actually deliberately make change was potentially different than what you might perceive. Are they always in social media? No, we're not seeing that with our participant, our representative sample that we have, even when doing so for groups that they're not a part of, which is very key too. So millennials may not be personally affected by your issue, but that doesn't mean that they're not interested. And that's a key piece that we have outlined here in the report, and I suggest that you spend time in that section. Recommendations. Make sure you know the people who are working on behalf of the social issues and causes that you care about. This is getting to know your population of your army of activists, the donors and volunteers that are out there. You have to create, you really do, have to create a continuum from interest to deeper action. And you have to measure that as you go forward. How many people come into the fold of our website, of our organization, and what are we doing to inspire them to move forward, right, with us? How do we inspire that action in the larger context, right? So if social policy change is to address something, then what actions are you leading the activist or the generation or individual in which we're talking about to create something next. And when you're calling on your audiences to act, don't single out those directly affected by the issue. It's the concept of the issue overall that somebody can be a part of, can latch on and have that affinity and loyalty, even if they may not know them. You know, I always like the solicitations that start with, well, you know somebody. You don't necessarily need to know somebody, but you can care about the issue, and you have a generation that's interested in standing up for those issues if it counters into the belief and value system of what they have. The last key takeaway, they want their voices to be heard, and for now are combining those with traditional forms. We've talked about this in years past. Online only is not an ideal environment. Online and offline tactics, it is a comprehensive approach to social engagement today, to cause engagement. If we only focus on one versus the other, you will miss. And hopefully this year's report shows you, of all of these actions that have been reported, that they are using traditional forms in combination with our digital forms and so forth. We need to be organizations that are ready to take anybody through all of these outlets, of course, but we cannot, at the peril of one versus the other, say we're only an online or we're only an in-person. It is a combination of both. And when you look at it, you have to honestly go back and say, have we adequately given the resources we need, knowing a very vocal generation is coming out, utilizing their voice, using traditional forms? Where are we with those? And are we able to provide to those individuals what they need to be successful with it? You know, directors of advocacy and stewardship and so forth. That is, as we see, an entry point for some of these, and they're believing that that's the most change. Obviously, we looked at even donations. Was that where you would create the most change? And not necessarily one of the top ones, as you saw earlier. Things like advocacy and raising voice and getting out there and being heard, they saw more active as well. So this is a key point as you look at ensuring that your organization is looking at it from a more holistic standpoint, and not just from these individuals that are here or there, but individuals that take action in multiple different ways. So here we are towards the end, and we'll get to some of your questions. They are coming in. Don't worry, and again, as much as we can, feel free to put some in there, and where we are on the list so far may be a little tough, but we'll get as many as we can. Here's what's coming up next. We are entering into the final phase of this year's research. Ethnographic inquiry and some qualitative methods that we're going to do. We're going to look at what they're saying. We're going to find out what's happening in some of the social spheres that we can track, some of our participants. And we'll be spending more time with them to go deeper and deeper into this. We're not pretending we have all the answers. So if you have questions and you want to understand something, let us know. Reply back and give us a sense of what you'd love to learn even more as we go into these qualitative measures. Our job is to be as transparent as possible during our process, and making that possible is inviting you into the research process as much as possible. January, we will release the final wave as well as the overarching learnings and findings from the 2017 Millennial Impact Studies. So make sure, you know, we'll let you know, of course, when that happens in January, but that's when you can look forward in the next piece. It is our goal, too, between now and then, to hopefully provide some deeper information. There's a lot of data, as you can imagine. And we do have more, obviously, and there will be chances for us to continue the discussion into certain subsegments of the data and characteristics. So we'll hopefully be able to post those between now and January. And if there is anything in particular, please let us know of that too. You can always share and download all of this at themillennialimpact.com as well, and feel free to share your thoughts directly with us via the email as you go forward with it. So as I mentioned, we are going to, from this standpoint, make sure that we can get to some of your questions in general. So you can put those into the GoToWebinar panel, as you see there, that's on your screen. And we'll get to between now and the end of our time together, which will be at the top of the hour. We know that I'm sure everybody is busy from there. One of the first questions that we look at is, what is the percentage, and the good thing is that we invited our team too to be with us on this, but what is the percentage, as we see here, of female respondents who voted, and would you only meant, and actually, Amy, do you want to cover that? What is the percentage of female respondents who voted?
Off the top of my head, Derek, I don't have it right in front of me, actually.
Okay. Yeah, we'll work on getting that, and as we're getting some of that information, we can head into the next question, which is around, was the sample limited to only California? I want to make sure that everybody understands this is a national representative sample. California is one of all states that was a part of this. Amy, do you want to talk anything about the geography in general that I haven't mentioned?
No, just to say that we really did try to align percentages of folks that we recruited to be a representative sample, both in the regions of the U.S. based on U.S. Census region, as well as, I think you indicated earlier, looking at the residential sections, that being suburban, urban, rural, that type of thing. And so a lot of the quotas that we've placed on folks to bring into our study are representative of the overall U.S. millennial generation.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And there's another question around the sample, where specifically, so that kind of helps you. And we do have a geography section in there where it comes from. And there are some questions in here, of course. You can definitely get a copy of this presentation. We will send that on along with the recording post this. In addition, it'll give us a day or so. We'll make sure and get that to you. And then we'll make sure and get the female voting piece here. One of the other questions that came in, which is, what is the level of volunteering among millennials did you see? If you look at, so again, these actions and participation, donations and volunteering was towards the bottom. It wasn't as high as we had seen. Now, some can argue that coming out and doing a protest or a rally is a form of volunteerism too as well. And there's been some debate as to how you would categorize volunteerism today. And so, so the thing that I would say here is, we're not talking about it from the perspective of maybe how others define volunteerism, but this study is from the perspective of the millennials' view of volunteerism. So the fact that that wasn't a high act, or they didn't categorize it that way, is an important piece. And in the report, you can see where that sits. The other thing is around, will you also send the questionnaire used? Yes, we can provide some of the questions that were used in there. We'll make sure and make a note of that. And one of the next questions that came down too is, did your research address millennials' choices when it comes to employment and other longer-term choices as actions for a cause they believe in? So for example, geography, they're willing to go someplace they feel would make an impact versus a desirable city or longer-term impact. Amy, did you recall anything in that? I don't believe we did go into employment and sort of choices on cities and so forth.
We did not, actually, and that is something that we could look at, either in phase 3 or in a separate investigation. But no, we didn't focus at all, actually, on that topic.
Yeah. This is a key next question, which is changing of trends, social issues, everything else in the data. One of the key things, as we mentioned, in 2016, we had, and we have this in the report in that section where we talk about issues and where they were. So Amy, I'm going to cue you up here a little bit to get those ready. But in terms of the key findings around changes and trends, can you talk a little bit about some of the social issue changes, Amy?
Yeah, in 2016, so I guess there's two pieces. 2016, we looked at issues of interest, and that was sort of, I don't want to say a generic list that we pulled together, but based on research that we had done previously, we wanted to understand, what were the top issues. For 2017, we started with phase 1, and we asked folks, what are the issues that you're most interested in, so that we could actually sort of compare apples to apples or have a list that was more pertinent to folks at this time point. And so that's where the answers came from, civil rights and racial discrimination, healthcare, employment and job creation. Those were all issues that were indicated in phase 1 that were of particular interest. And then we also brought in the issues of immigration and wages and things like that that are typically causes and issues that are of interest to most people, but also millennials in particular.
Yeah, great, thank you. One of the other questions around some comparatives. So in addition to the comparatives around generations, so I want to inform all of it that the purpose of the study when it was originally started in 2009 was not to do comparatives against generations. Those comparatives can be a little challenging to do. I know we desire to connect or compare, say, boomers to millennials, Xers to millennials, millennials to centennials, and others. But we choose not to. Our goal is to report from their perspective and what's happening. And so that's what we've been doing over the course of the last 10 years. What's also very difficult in doing comparatives against generations is there's so many factors that go into those. So economic conditions are very different, as well as social and cultural norms have changed. One example we usually use that's fairly simple and common to understand would be that social acceptance of, say, going into debt. That is, say, for college, more acceptable than when it was for older generations. It just wouldn't have been an option. So there's changes in society that we can't control for to do those kinds of comparatives. but often a good question, and it's one that we get a lot. We have in the years past, you might want to direct yourself to 2015's report and 2014, where we looked at the differences between managers and millennials, boomers versus millennials. That was the only time in that particular environment that we did some comparative. So that would be in your 2015 and 2014 report. The next question I have is around the LGBTQI community, which is, were members of that community surveyed and how did they respond? Amy, do you have any information on that in terms of responses of those particular individuals?
Yeah, unfortunately we don't. That is something that we have flagged to look at in the subsequent phase 3 part of this issue, because the fact that civil rights came out to be the #1 issue, and specifically it was racial discrimination, but then as you look down through the list, the interest in LGBTQI population was actually about 8th on the list down, and so because it wasn't as high as civil rights, we separated it out, but we do need to take a look at that individually, because it would be interesting to denote how much of our sample is within that population.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, these are good questions. Thank you so much. We'll make sure and get those. We'll make sure and get those back to you in the next phase, if not. But this is something that we'll further investigate as we go forward. One of the next question is do you look for millennials to change the landscape of Washington politics and begin to hold legislators accountable for their rhetoric? This is an interesting question. And will they urge action upon issues of concern to this generation? So that's something that we want to further discuss in the qualitative too going forward. But we can say obviously that they do believe in change, in necessarily looking at legislators and asking and contacting them. The question is how that accountability is helped, but they do believe that that piece is very key, and legislators working through the institution of government. But something that we'll work further into in the next phase as well. This kind of goes in line with there around calling representatives. You know, how much do we know that that will happen? We didn't necessarily ask a particular bill or anything else. You know, here's an upcoming bill. Would you do that? And overall, but given the fact that they had already participated in those actions. In contacting, one could obviously look at, or sort of look at in the next future, that it's likely that they're going to participate, given that that was an action as well that was taken. One question was around corporate engagement, particular sponsorship by brands. You know, do we look at there's an increase of sponsorship by brands? Is there anything, I don't believe Amy, but I always got to make sure I'm right here. Is Amy anything around sponsorship and brands?
You know, there isn't, other than the category that we had, that they changed the way they purchase products, and I do think that that is something that we could specifically look at. And I remember, just off the top of my head, was one woman who, instead of going to her regular physician, ended up going more to Planned Parenthood, for example, because that was something that was on the chopping block, if you will, and was really sort of a social policy, public policy type of issue for her. And so instead of going to the traditional physician, she ended up supporting their services. So that was one way. So I think in phase 3, that's something worth investigating a bit more, because it did resonate with so many of our population, so many of our sample within the population.
Yeah. Absolutely. Amy, and were you able to obviously pull some of the voting respondents now as well in the female and male?
Yeah, 55% was the female vote. And I believe that is captured actually on one of our slides, but I just didn't have it in front of me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also in the report too. And if I only mentioned the male, I think I mentioned both of them, but I apologize if it wasn't clear when we were going through it. And that piece is in the voting section on the report too as well. Well, of course, we're out of time now, and I want to thank you for spending the hour with us going through some of the data. There's a lot more there, and there's a lot of questions, of course, and questions to arise from going forward and where we go. So please share that information with us as we do. Share the report as we go forward. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing study, so we're further defining and refining what we need to investigate going forward. So having these conversations within conferences and events and so forth will be a key piece for us over the course of the next 3 to 4 months as we go out, share the results and findings, and hear from you. So we look forward to presenting more information over the course of those 3 to 4 months, and we thank you for being a part of this webinar and also reading the Millennial Impact Project and its reports. We want to thank the Case Foundation for their support since 2009 for the project. Please give them a shout out as well, and we'll look forward to the next time that we'll visit together online. Take care.